Okay, so our first reading is from 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 6.
Bako paso gutane na le lita shumwe la sa do kisita supporter de le khu do so da we hesu no ba apo so paluta do so akhimele a olo do me abato ko do so da we do so akhimele pliwe do si ba on no odoga ho do pato ba do na no daga ba ne me aba mnule do so da we si ba paluta do so akhimele so pa ma lo ya le ta de mi do si ba ya du te nya pwa le ta le yme na ma ta ri klo do ta le yma lo na ne no de ga de ge do ye pa lo ye ke pwa phe I phe ni lo do khe ki ni e ta o le ne sya pha la ne me minu de mi le he lo ya le ko ye lo le ye si bu ke me de me ba di ne do da le ne ti ne ba de pha ni lo do paluta do sister so da we do si ba o ko a to so to ski to o ba le yesu a phola ba pa phota khwa de phan ne me the a has ke po mine do ko so ski o we lo do so da we si so paluta do do si ba o le ya tho ne po mu to o ba do kwa te ni nya ka ka do pa phota khwa a lo kho de phan ne so ski we do ko ne mata di a to so to ski ba to lo age di aga de pha ta pa so ski o le lo kho pu le mi sa di ni lo do paluta do ne he lo o le ta a so ski lo age di ko to o ba phe ne ba o the ta me nya ko le ta hi ni we le yu a me nya di to akapa ke ko le mi ti ni le a hi ni we lo.
Our second reading is Mark 2, verses 23 to chapter 3, verse 6.
Now, lisa suki ta ne lima ko sa do ki sapo ki sita de le ta si hu. Do tamata le ale khotru si o pwe wa le mi obwini do aple abod phale ta phemu do de to bu ase lo do pa phrishe te phasi ba o kwa awe te mata de ba le mi obwi ani ne me ba mne le do awe da si ba o so da wi la atur pha tu ane ba ta lo o do ta wi ata do me amata dile ne tu de pha ba nor kho ba me alen le ywa hi pu le paluta ko so abe ab so e be ya ta so do ota me nya ko le atri oba wi othe paluta ado de pha lo do hi se ko we le pa o do or pha lo do si ba o ta le mu obu ya ni ne ke tho we le pa gnyo ko lo de me ba pa gnyo le mu obu nya ko ba ma ta di ne do pa gnyo pho khwa I me mu obu ni se ko akasa lo do le ne ko do we su bu blo pu do pa le a khi do pa la su khi thor kho we phe ne de ga lo do le mu obu ya ni ne me ma black ta de ma black ta le ne kwa hu o di to akasko o lo do si ba le kwa la su khi tho de kho ne we sa ta le ta ki pu ke do si ba pwa de pha ne ta le mu obu ya ni ne me pe ri ma ta ria me pe ri ma ta le me pe ri u ke kho ke pwa ta tmu a me pe ri ma ti ta le da we te o bo ka la lo do me ata u la we ti ata ko we a ho lo kwa tri o la ta tho do si ba kwa gnyo de ga ne yu tho ne su ke do yu tho we do su black ke lo do pa phari she te de pha ne ha tho ku ko kha do di to akama ha go o di le ne ku lo ta do pa hero pho de pa tho da o lo lima ko sa do ta sa po te le khu.
So in the text which we just read, we saw two stories which involved Jesus, the Pharisees, and the Sabbath.
Now, Lisaski as her til paleva pa on a petiwe dano. Da te weda kikano la apate weda dog say shukri no. Do pa parishe til pa do me weda no mu obu ani no lipo call munwini.
In these two stories, the authority of Jesus is being questioned.
Le tate ki khai ia punena. Kasai shukriata ni so ni gomota ni na bata tikwa opema.
In both cases, the questions have to do with how Jesus keeps the Sabbath day.
Na le tate ki mila pu pepe ini na tati kwa tirpane miwe da na le kasai shukrine na awe da pasos hiwe da mi obuini dile.
In our times, many people are used to treating the day of worship like any other day.
Le peso to pay ni na pa aga ni na awe da ma ba we da mi obui ni na ke we da le tabu to ba to mi ni dia mi we da de to mi ni la gu ga tirpa ni la.
I see many people who call themselves Christians, but who work on the day of worship.
Ayiti we da na pa la kolo ta le pa kripo aga tirpa ni na awe tirpa na ma we da ta le mi obui ni.
Many other people make other people work by going to stores or restaurants on the Sunday.
Rani pala aguga aga tirpane na we tirpana awe de kane na mewe da pa aguga tirpa mata la gona pela we tirpale apuita le sepu mege na le ota le restaurant mege le mi obu enima le pa mata po tirpane ka ba mata la goma.
Things were different in Jesus' days.
No ta los howe da le ka sai shukri so kanila.
The Jews in that time regarded the Sabbath day as very important.
Ayu da po te pa na le ka sai shukri so kanina awe te pa we da mi obu ni na mi we da mi ni la re do we da do manila.
But what was the Sabbath?
No ta le obu ni mi we da tam ni le na.
Why was it so important?
Bam ni ko la re do we da do manile.
In order to answer that question, we have to go back to the Old Testament.
Di to le ka si so we da ta ti kwa ini na pa ba ki da ki we da le li so si to tropo li so si la li to tropo.
We have to look at how the Sabbath was understood in the days of Jesus.
Pa ba kwa we da no le mu obu ni na ba ta tinya na pe o le ka sai shukri so kane dile.
The Sabbath day was created when God created the world.
Mi obwini ni no bata tilo palo ono asagto pele ka sayuano tilo eda hokuni no.
In Genesis 1, we read that God created the world.
Le temoshe sa do tane papa ba da le ka sayua tilo eda hokuni no.
God made the Sabbath day when he created the world.
Ka sayua tilo eda mi obwini no mi boni no mi nini no pela eda tilo eda hokuni no.
He made the world in 6 days,
Awela tilo eda hokulu hutotapu.
And on the 7th day he rested.
No le nini tinini aweda obu weda ni no.
Genesis 2 verses 1 through 3 says, Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation.
Na le lita moshe sa do ki sapo te le thani siwe dadi I. Do mu ko do hoku do ki ye afimu wa mune. We we kele lo do le minwi ni tinine yua mawe tala amawe. Do obu le minwi ni tinile ki yata mala mawe kele lo. Do yua soge minwi ni tinine do pa sosyo lo agidi I. Obu wele mutinine le ki ye atamala ti lo do mawe kele lo.
The Sabbath day goes right back to the creation of the world.
Mi obuni na kegda kiweda na le sato le tabati ke to atalili kasayati lo hokulili ni la.
It was not a rule that was invented later just for Israel.
Te mi weda le na tabla le ta du to weda na le pa isu la po go le kini ba.
Already at creation, God blessed this day.
Na le sato le na kasayati lo talili ni na kasaywa sogi weda miniti ni I li ni la.
Means that God made this day both special and good.
a copy of that look as I were tailor that mini way in le a me way that lolo so no do me way that la kimileni no.
God made this day holy.
Cause I were no do get away that mini in tailor that las a sauce free.
It was set apart from the other 6 days.
Na mini way ne batapa lolo so or le mini laga hunine.
Was a day which God claimed specially for his own.
Mi we da mini tini le ka sayua no ta we da to we da le ataka we da la mi we da a we da ka sa da we mini no ni lo.
When God gave the 10 commandments to Israel, he reminded them that he had set this day aside for himself.
Hele ka sayua he we da ma lo bor si le poi su la puni no ka sayua du ti no to kia we ti pa le no ka sayua pa lo we da mini tini I no lo so le a we da no sa da we ni lo.
In Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, the 4th commandment reads, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy."
No le likimo she sa do kise sa po hotel le si tani si wedi ti no tomi obuni la na pa so ski o agi ni de ke na ka ma bata huni do na mata ma kele lo me nui ni ti ni ne me yuan ka sa ta obui ani lo ne da ge no po kwa ge no po mu ge ne ku no po kwa ge ne ku no po mu ge ne sa po ko po de ge par ko bo me po la o la ne petro apu ge tu te mata ma not mi de ge agedi kunya tapune yate lo muko do hoko do pole do kieta ola wete papu do o buwele munui ni tinini lo mata dini do yuasuge munui ni tinini do pasoski olo.
God had already taught his people that the Sabbath was a special day.
Kasaywa na we tolo tiwe da po gomu le plelili no le awe munui ni mewe da muni lo so special de nimo.
Now he taught his people what that meant.
Pay ni na we da tolo we da apwa gomu la ta we nya kopya dileni lo.
It was a day of rest.
Me we da muni le me we da ta obui amini ni lo.
They were not to put on work clothes and spend the day at work.
Awe te de pat ba kudo kata we da ta pita masi kusika da awe da kebale mata ni ba.
This wasn't just a day of rest for the father.
Te me we da le me obui ani we ne no le te me tele pa go ba.
It was also for his children,
Me se ko la putir pa go.
for the servants,
Do la ta kita putir pa go.
the animals,
Asapu ko putir pa go.
and even for people who didn't worship God.
Do me we da le le putir pa le at buto ba to sa yuatir pa go ni lo.
In other words, the Sabbath day was a day of rest for every part of God's creation which was under their authority.
No, le pametele ta to agatmina. Awe Israel no, awe mawe munini ni no, me we da munile ta obuya munile. Awe kasaywa ta bati ti de pake le kesia poko le po Israel po we da dota so tani so ne mo le tabati ti ti panake le kesia poko tabati ti pake le kesia poko ni lo.
40 years later, Moses gave the 10 Commandments again.
Lani Luis he will a king no, so moshi he locked the weather. Tamalo boss he a thought blog dog.
The 4th commandment starts off the same.
No, Tamalo Louis Bourbon in a sat weather meet at me hollow.
But then Moses wrote that Israel was to rest for a different reason.
Mas had on a penny no, so moshi qued a look is will put it panel, kaba o bui weather no, le tagile a loss weather at the migado.
They were to rest because God delivered Israel from slavery to King Pharaoh of Egypt.
I waited to pack about o bui weather no, mele, Kasaiwa no, mapu pleta kia waited pa, le gualo no le sopa no paro le ko ko putu puma.
Elsewhere in the laws of Moses, God forbids work even at the busiest times of year, namely the time of harvesting and planting.
No. Le lisa sia ga de tone pa pra da no awe de kan ne ka sa ya hilawa da ta to da to le so mo shi no a tro we da le awe de kan ne po isu la po te pa no tu de ma da de no le ta sa to le a ke we da le ta pi ta ma a sa to da le no le mi we da ku bu a sa to no tu da sa to da le no no ne ka sa ya tro we te no ka sa ya ti we te la we te pa ka ba ma da ba mo.
God also forbade building a fire on the Sabbath day.
Kasaywa trawe te la tu de market hawe da me una le awe me obwini ba.
Leviticus 23, verse 3 says that it was also a day for convocation.
Le li ta mo she sa do kisita sa po te po ne si we da no. A muni we ne me we da muni le no ta pa po to tha si ko.
That means that it was a day in which God's people would assemble together to worship God.
Ta we na kopya me we da le no muni we ne me we da mitini le kasaywa pa go mu no pa po to tha tu pu ko ba ni bu to ba to we da oni lo.
Now, there was an exception to these rules.
No, miwe data hiwe data kwelo lo so le table we.
Since the Sabbath was a day of worship,
No, mi obwini we ne miwe da mini le tabuto batogo.
the work of worship went on.
No, ta buto bato atapita mani sele tamo.
The priests in the temple were busy working all day.
Kewe da paluta tirpa le no talu hiepuna we tirpa atapita ma ala mata dodninya.
They still had to build fires for sacrifices.
Awe tirpa no kabati tawe da me u tirpa le no taluta pa tirpa go.
They had to do extra sacrifices because the Sabbath was a special day.
Awe tirpa no kabati tawe da no me u no le da kabama da no taluta pa la ato no me da le awe kan ne me o buini ni na me da le awe mini lo so so ko ni.
They had to build fires for baking the special bread of presence, which they set on a table before the Lord every Sabbath.
Awe tirpa no kaba market awe da me u no le awe tirpa no bewe da ko no kuwe da ko lo so so no le awe ta me nya ko mo le awe bata palo le awe sono ko no le kasaywa me nya no le me obwini.
Throughout Israel's history, God's people often ignored the command to rest on the Sabbath day.
Le kwa Israel pua ta sisote so do to nya ne ya you apa go me tirpa no no nyo ne na we tirpa no awe te patinya ta no to do na we da kasaywa at aminila ta hiota obu amini mama.
They also preached that God would bless his people if his people kept the Sabbath days.
Na we tirpa na se te la we da no le awe tirpa no me pa so ski we da me obu ni ne no awe kasaywa ka sugi ani lo.
For example, Isaiah 56, verses 1 and 2 says, "Thus says the Lord, keep justice and do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come, and my righteousness be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing any evil."
No le liwisha ya sedo yesihu sabote de le kine si wedi I no yua sidi I doneta sinyoto do mata tota lurki agedi I yita wike kake obuteli do yita tota lolo ako platolo pala mata I do pagnyo pola hika o la tonemi obuini di to atu temaba odegi do kwa sudi to atu temata odegi ni basuri welo.
Most Israelites did not listen to these warnings.
Po aga no adkine no we tir pater dog na we da ta hiplo tir phaiba.
In the year 586 BC, Israel was taken into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon.
Le na aweda kaneni na yegi ya khochi hu de klule kriople ani de banena. Wa iswela poter pana bata le skhaji le tikona le awe babulo apuna le sopan bukani sanina.
Years later, many did return to the land of Israel.
Le de blue ni de blue punina we pa aganina heki baki su iswela punina.
Some of them still forgot that God had punished them for their disobedience.
Awe te no ne na papi no diwe data le look sa senior or couple lawe te pat dognata ba punina.
But the rabbis taught the people to obey the Lord and to follow his Sabbaths.
Ba satana kina awe te pa arabana arabi atharano to lowe te pa lawe te pa ba dogna weda kasaywa kluda ka ba dogan ka ba lupo tweda me obwini ni no.
They warned the people that if they did not obey all of God's laws, including the Sabbath, they would be scattered among the nations again.
Awe te pa no du heplo weda kane kasaywa po mula we te pa mit dogna weda kasaywa tato banena pa weda do weda kane mu obwini ni no. Awe te pa no ko lopra ka do weda le tu ko ga do.
They also taught the people that if they were obedient, God would rescue them.
Awe te patolo se ko da ya po ko mila we te pa mi dogna da kasaywa klini no kasaywa ko mapu ple awe te ni no.
They would have their own king from the house of David and not a king from a foreign nation.
Kasaywa te ala we te pa ko we da do ano sa da we so pa no le he we da le so pa da we he pu no awe te pa no ta pe ba le no awe ti wu ko ga so lo so pa ba.
The people obeyed.
Le tane ko ne pa ko mi dogna we da.
They took the commandment to obey the Sabbath seriously.
Awe te pa no hika we da kasaywa ta malo la dogna we da mi obwini no le ta tinyo te pa bu.
The rabbis went a step further.
No ne ne athara no arabi te pa ne ya alle do da le sunya to do.
They did not want to break these laws by mistake.
Awe te pa no te edom mahago we da ta to te pa ile ta magmata ko ne ba.
They did not want to be tempted to disobey these laws.
Awe te pa te edo da le taklip so le di to le atu to dogna we da ta to te pa ne ba.
So they built a fence around the laws to keep people from disobeying them.
Le tanya ko ne na we te pa na no pe kha we da na ke we da ti tha we da no we da na ko re no ko me ne do te de ka da po ko mu no di to le we ti to ma ka ma ba we da ta ble I ne.
And they did this by making many rules to help the people to obey the Sabbath.
Le ama we da ta ini na di to le we ka ne do na we ti pa ko we da ta ble a go no di to le po ko mu ti pa ti to ma ka ma da ta ble ka sa ya ta ma lu I.
These rules were later written down.
No ata ble ti pa na le kini na ta ko lo ti ka we da.
We still have them.
Awe ti pa ta o di we da.
It's called the Mishnah Shabbat.
No ta ko le Mishnah Sabbath no.
It has 53 chapters of rules about how to obey the Sabbath.
No weda no weda kanini no akuto weda ye chite no chapters no akuto no vanini no baka weda do wed tablo thir palen akabado kana weda mi obwini no minwini ni dilema.
In chapter 7, we find 39 categories of work that were forbidden on the Sabbath day.
No le aweda kane ta atari mupwala awen wed agikuto no ginwini no peti weda no ta weda tesi kwika no le ke weda ta pita male no ta tro le atut ma da le mi obwini dungi.
I tell you all these things so that you can understand what life was like when Jesus grew up.
Yete banata tir pai ke le ke sine ya le no ni te to na kana pa we da le ta mu ma ta di le pele ka se shu krido to we khani
He lived in a place where people took the Sabbath very seriously.
awe da o we da ta lo le no pele pa go mu no hi kha we da mu o bu ni no tu nyu to pa do mani lo
He lived in a place where there were many rules about what you might or might not do on the Sabbath.
awe da o we da no ta lo pele no awe ta du to we da no ta ble a go no le ta le no ba ma do ta le de ba ma le mu bu ni ban mo
When Jesus came to earth, he taught that the Sabbath was all about him.
Pele ke se shukri na hello we da le ho ko kle khani na awe da to lo we da apa go mu le na mu obu ni na mi we da the da ta la ba kha do o le tabu tho ba tho o khele ni na
Jesus is the Son of God.
ke se shukri ni mi we da yu apo kwa ni la
He is God.
awe da mi we da yu ani la
He is the one whom they were worshiping on the Sabbath day.
awe da mi we da pa de ga la we tir pha no ke yu apo go mu bu tho ba tho ti on le mu obu ani mo
And so our title for this lesson is Who is Greater, Jesus or the Sabbath?
no ke da le bata malo ko to ni no awe de kan ne mi we da di no mata do de ke le mo ke se shukri do a me mi ane mi obu ni do le
And we'll look at the two stories.
po kwa we da no ta te ki ka no
So, first, the Pharisees accused Jesus of allowing his disciples to work on the Sabbath day.
ta ko ti de mi ni no mi we da le awe wa pressure tir pa no we tir pa no a pe ka ma we da ke se shukri la we da ple bo le amata le mi obu ni
And second, the Pharisees used the man with the paralyzed hand to charge Jesus with breaking the Sabbath.
ta kimi de mi no pa pressure tir pa no awe tir pa no tu we da no pa lobli de ga no pa su lobli de ga no le awe da ke hi we da ta ka ma le ke se shukri na we da ma ago we da mi obu ni mo
So, first, the Pharisees accused Jesus of allowing his disciples to work on the Sabbath.
no ta termina le papashe tir pana we tir pana pe pe ta we da se shukri le na ple we da a ple bo tir pa le ma da le mo bu ni
On one occasion, Jesus and his disciples were traveling from one town to another.
le te block kan na ke se shukri da ple bo tir pa le we da le to wo te ple na do ha to we da do le da su to wo ga ple do
Jesus was carrying out the task of preaching in the towns of Galilee.
na ke se shukri na we da ma we da amu da le ka ba se te lo da no le awe kalila we tir pa
The disciples took grain
lo le khoga ta kane na aple bona we da hi o we da bu sam
They rubbed it in their hands to remove the husk.
awe tir pa no li lu we da la su pu no de ta le ama u we da be mo
Then they ate it.
ma we tir pa o we da
Pharisees saw it.
wa praise tir pa ti we da
They were unhappy.
awe tir pa ta ku ba
Why?
pam nu ko le
Were the disciples stealing?
wa aple bot ke sai su kre ple bot tir pa ni o hu da
No.
te me ba
Deuteronomy 23, verse 23 and 24, allowed people to go into a farmer's field and to take grain as long as they did not cut it with a sickle.
na pele li ya mo she sa do kisi te sapo kisi te tule kisi luina awe pe me pa bani na vtiwe dale awe ka saywa a ke we dale na kwa go me te pa bata ple ole awe te pa me le ko ba we da awe pwa asi pu plo pu ni na awe te pa ne owe da te mo awe di awe da te na ta pa lo ni ole pwa popo ya po lo so mo la we tir pa mutu kuwe le ba le tag mutu kuwe da bu tir pa ni le tag e ba ne ba la mo
Rather, they are upset because the disciples are picking grain on the Sabbath day.
me me ka ni we tir pa ne na ta thora no ke we da le we de ka ni ne pwa ka se shukriya ple ba tir pa na no awe de ka ne hi o da bu le mo bu ni mo
In Mishnah Shabbat 7.2, it says that one who threshes, removing the kernel from the husk, is doing one of their 39 categories of work on the Sabbath.
Le Mishnah nó cái vậy đã le pa yuda po atable nó Arabi atable nó le awe akoto nui de sabokine nó si we da nó paraga le awe da mu yo bu nó awe da mu ma te bui we da bu nó u thok we da bu a pe nó ne nó mi we allo ba we da le no gi te chi kwi nó la we te pa ma da le mu obui ni mo
That was not allowed.
ta we ne ta ti ya kwe ba mo
How will Jesus respond?
Că să și Cristi să că era dile.
Will he show them that their rules were made by men and that they were not found in the Bible?
Că să și cred că dune awe te le no awe te pata ble ne no bata du to le pa nyo do to bata komya to we da le li sa ski pu bania.
He could have done that.
Că să și crime ma we dine thema.
Instead, Jesus uses this opportunity to show them who he was.
Me me de ko ne no că să și Cristi we da ta kwe ya ba we ile că dune we te le awe ne no că să și crine me we da mata le ne no.
He uses the Jewish practice of using a small example to prove a large one.
Awe tuwe da no pa awe yuda po ata no ata adu ate no le ke dune we da ta la dor kape.
He goes to the Old Testament and reminds them of what King David did.
No ke se shukri na we da ki we da no le li so ska la li do tru do ne du thi no to ke we ti pa le da lu so pa da wi mati we da mo.
The Pharisees would never disagree with the Old Testament.
Pa parishe ti pa na we ti pa na awe tu lo we da awe li so ski mo. Kamya te da le li so ski tu lo we da le li so ski ba ne te thi no blo ba mo.
They also had a great deal of respect for the great King David.
Na we ti pa ne no we da do no ta pa do pa ke we da no awe so pa da wi no la mi we da so pa pa do mo.
He tells them a story from the days of Abiathar, who later became high priest.
Na we te pia we da no we ta ke la mi we da no so Abiathar no le kina we ke ta ke we da we ta ka ne paluta do mo.
When David and his men were hungry, they went to the tabernacle at Nob to ask for food.
No pele awe so da we no da apwa timiti bo te pa no tata we ta no awe te pa lewe da le no awe bublo pu no lo ne le ta lo le no ab no lo ne awe te pa no khi we da awe pa lu ta le ta omo.
The priest Ahimelech gave David and his men the holy bread, which only the priests were supposed to eat, according to Leviticus 24, verse 9.
Pa lu ta no Ahimele no so Ahimele no we da so pa da we we da so da we da apwa timiti bo te pa no le ko so ski no ko we ni no te da pa lu ta te pa ka ba o we da mo.
Why did Ahimelech do that?
Bam ni ko le no so Ahimele ma we di ne le.
Well, it was necessary, Jesus said.
Me we da le ta la lo we da no no ni no ka se shu krisi we da.
David and his men desperately needed bread.
So da we da pa timiti bo te pa no we te pa lo ba we da ta o te pa ka te ni no.
The Bible does not say that David or Ahimelech were sinning, even though they broke the law.
No, lisa si te siwe le no sa Dawido sa Ehimele no awe te pa mata de ba ni ba no pe awe te pa mu ma awe da table ta tu ta da le ni.
Why?
Bam ni ko le.
David had been anointed by Samuel to be the future king.
So Dawi no bata do po le so shumu ela la we da ke me we da le so pa le kasume ya ni no.
He had to eat in order that he could stay alive.
Awe te pa no awe ko ba awe da ta de ta we da ko ba o mu we da ni no.
He had to eat in order that he could carry out his future role as king.
Aweda ke ba aweda ta dita aweda ke sema
What
weda
the
lama le ami weda ke bake da
what
sopa.
the only get
His companions also had to eat.
No, aweda pala le the got huta do ate pani ke ba ota sikoni lo.
So if that was okay for David to do, what about the son of David?
Ta we ni no me ta ba weda le no sopa da we ma weda ni no me le apo we sopa da we apo so da we apo kwar komo.
Jesus is greater than David.
Kese shukri ni do ni weda so da we ni lo.
His mission was even more important than David's.
Aweda ta pita mani do ni weda so da we kini lo.
Shouldn't his companions have food as well?
Le pala le to kota do te de pani no to kro weda do ta oni ya.
Shouldn't they be allowed to break a rule made only by men?
Awe te de pana ta to kro hia kwele ka ba mahago weda no ta blele no ta blele pa nyo du o to ni ya.
After all, this is Jesus.
No. Me me de koni no. Pa we ni no mi weda Yeshu ni lo.
Jesus ends the discussion by saying, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Na ne ba de ka se shukri na ma ka te ki weda ata ka to do si wedi no. Ma ta di ni do pa nyo po kwa I me mi obu ni si ko akasalo.
What did this mean?
Ta we ne ka bia me dile.
How was Jesus Lord of the Sabbath?
Na Yeshu me weda no mi obu ni akasani dile.
The Bible shows us that Jesus is God.
Jesus hu dine pa le ka se shukri ne me weda akasayani lo.
He created the world together with God the Father and God the Holy Spirit.
Aweda te la weda hoko no tupuko do no pa kasaywa po kasa do ta sa su kasani lo.
He rested on the first Sabbath that was made.
Aweda obu weda no le mi obu ni akoti kete no teni le aweda mi obu ni le ta te lo akoti teni ni lo.
He is one with the Father who gave them the laws about the Sabbath.
Aweda mi weda patuga no hu do pa kasai no la hi lo weda no mi obu ni ata to ta thoni lo.
Since he was Lord of the Sabbath day, he alone could decide what was allowed on the Sabbath day.
No, dia we mi weda no mi obu ni akasa to ni no te weda to ga oni no sete weda do ple weda ta le no weda kane mi obu ni no a mi weda dile ti weda ni no.
We need to understand this in order to understand the words of Jesus before this.
No, poko lo na pe weda ta we di to le poko na pe weda le a we ka sai shukri ata to no to klile dile ta we ni.
And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath."
A weda si weda di ino. Ta le mi obu ni ne ke to we le pa nyo go. Te mi ba pa nyo le mi obu ni go ba.
The Pharisees had missed the point of the Sabbath day.
Pa praisha te pana we te na pe weda le mi obu ni agi ba.
They made so many rules
A we te pana do to da table ama.
that it seemed like man was made in order to obey the Sabbath rules.
Allo ga we da nya di to na le we de kan ne pa nyo ni na bata ti o le da ka ba do na we da mi obu ni mo.
Jesus was saying that the Sabbath was meant to be a benefit for the people.
Me me le ka sai shu krisi ba we te na mi obu ni no ta a we de kan ne ta ti lo we da le ka mi we da ta ba blu ba po le pa go mi go.
It was a day of rest.
Mi we da mi ni te ni le ta obu ya go.
It was a day of worship.
Mi we da mi ni le ta bu to ba to go.
It was a day to put away all distractions.
Mi we da mi ni te ni le ta ba pa te ku we da ta mati ta bo klo ti pa kele.
It was a day for listening to God by hearing the reading of the scriptures.
Na mi we da le mi ni te ni le ba do na we da ka sa yu no le po do na we da ka sa yu ta pa da ka sa yu lu ta li sa ski.
It was a day for praying to God.
Mi we da mi ni te ni le no ta ba tu pa to su ki ta su ta ba tu pa su sa yu.
was a day for thinking about God.
มีเวดามินีเตนีเลยเนาะแต่สุกมูบาคาดอกไซวาเกกโล
Life is busy.
แต่อมุนีมีเวดาแต่มาอาโดมา
There were always so many things to do.
แต่เล่นก็บามาเนี่ยเวดามาทบเนี่ย
God made the Sabbath so that men would have a day of rest to focus on worshiping God, their Creator.
ก็ใส่ว่าตีล้อดามีอบุนีดีตอลปว่าฮอกโปติรพาเนาะก็โอเวดาดอมมีตินีลก็อบุยเวดาดอกก็กว่าทอตาลุลสุตาบูทอบาทอเวดาอัตบาติกสานี่เนาะ
The Pharisees made the mistake of focusing on the rules and forgot the reason for the day.
ไม่เมลกว่าพระเชติรพานะเวติรพามากมาบาเวดาตากมาอีเนาะลาเวติรพากว่าทอเวดาเลตาเลติรพาเลอากกว่าทอเวดาเลอเวอัตบูทอบาทอกนี่เนาะ
Pharisees turned this day into a day of following the rules and forgot to follow the Lord.
ว่าพระเชตโพติรพานะเวติรพาขาเวดามินีเวอีดีตอลอากปอดถ้วยเวดาเนาะก็ลูปอดถ้วยดาตับเลติรพาเนาะดอเวติรพาตาปินเนาะกูเวดาลาปอเวดากะไซวาเกลม
Imagine that somebody is driving a car
เนาะโชโมรอกว่าเนาะปอดกันนี่นอทเวดากะ
and comes to a stoplight.
แฮบเวดาเลือเวดกันนี่เมอุปตุลอนี่
The stoplight is red, which means you have to stop.
เนาะแกเวดาเลือเมอุปตุลอเนี่ยโกเวดาครอบเนี่ยเวดาเลือเบาอุปตุเปเน
But a police officer is directing traffic.
มาซาดอเนาะแกเวดาเลือเวดกันนี่ police เปเลดกันนี่เนาะเวดาเอาเวดาเรเวดาเนาะฮีเวดาเปลเวดาเนาะเอาเวกากะบาเลบาเกมอ
And the police officer beckons at the person to go.
ไม่เมลเนาะบ่เนี่ยเอาเวเปเลดกันนี่เนาะเอาเวดาเนาะวีทเวดาซื้อเนาะเมื่อดาปวลาอุปตุกันนี่เมื่อกะบาเลเวดามอ
But the man stops
Masana ke parganya wa da opetu penela
and says, I can't go.
awete la jelerte ba
The light is red
me ugo ko ne
and I don't want to be in trouble with the police.
mani te edo no we da ta ko ta ke ju ba te do le pele hi ya ta ko ta ke ba mo
That person is silly because he is talking to the police officer.
pargane na we da me da pa ko lo ka la mo na ke ni na me da la we da ku to da we da kan ne pele ke ni
The very person who enforces the law.
ke da no pele ga ko la we da no hi kha we da ta ma we da ti ko ta ble mo
That's what the Pharisees were doing.
ta we ne ma ta di pa parisha purga ma we so
They were talking to the one who made the law and did not realize it.
awe ti pa ko to ta we do no purga le no pa lo we da no ta tu ta to no ba sana ki no we ti ti nya we ba
We can do that too if we focus on rules and do not focus on Jesus Christ.
pa ma we da ta we ne ti mi ko ti we da no pa mi kwa tho we da ta lu kwa ta lu su no ta tu ta to no ke we da le ta ble no pa mi tu kwa tho we da su issue ba ne
Do we go to church because it is the rule that we have to go to church?
pele ba we da yu le ta po pu no mi we da le po we da do ta ble le ba le ko ni a
Or do we go to church because we want to follow Jesus Christ?
me te me ba ko ni no pele we da le ta po pu pele ba ya me le pe do po we da ka se shu kri ki ni a
Do we obey the 10 commandments because we have to?
po do ka na we da ta ma lo bo si ne me le po ko ba do ka na ko ni a
Or do we obey them because we love Jesus Christ?
me te me ba ko ni no me te me ko ni no po do ka na we da no ta ma lo bo si no ta ma lo ka sa wa ta to te pa me le pe e we da ka se shu kri ko ni a
And that brings us to our second story.
Bone ke ne no hes ko pa su no ta te ki kar ka pe ni
The Pharisees used the man with the paralyzed hand to charge Jesus with breaking the Sabbath.
pa pa she po te pa su we da no pa la su la de de no ti pa la ki we da ka se shu kri ta ka ma le a we da ma ha go we da mu obu ni mo
After giving us the story of the disciples taking grain on the Sabbath, Mark gives us a second story about Jesus, the Pharisees, and the Sabbath.
no le pa na we da no a we ta khe le no ก็ใส่ชุกดาเปลบอติพานะเลฮีเอาไว้ดับบูเนาะเลบูเซเลมอบุนีเวลาคินีเนาะเอาไว้สมักุนะไว้ฮีก็ดอกปานะตาเคคีอยู่ที่บาคาดก็ใส่ชุกนี่เนาะ
In this story, Jesus is preaching in a synagogue in Galilee.
นะมีไว้ดัลเอาไว้ปะไพรเชดมือบุนีเอาไว้เลือดตาเตไว้บุนีเนาะเอาไว้ก็ใส่ชุกรีนะเอาไว้ดัเสียเตแล้วดัลบุบลอบุลกาลิลานี่เนาะ
There's a man with a paralyzed hand.
ว่าเอาไว้ดัดกานะเอาไว้ดัเอาไว้จูลอบลีไว้ดาม
He cannot move his hand.
เอาไว้ดามาหัวจูดเตบะ
He cannot work with his hand.
เอาไว้ดามาดัลจูดเตบะ
The Pharisees were happy that this person was sitting in front of Jesus.
ว่าไพรเชเตพานะไว้ดัตาคือไว้ดัลเนาะว่าซูลอบลีดกานะไว้สินะบูดกใส่ชุกรีมา
Jesus was known to heal people.
ก็ใส่ชุกรีในบัตตาเตญาลาไว้ดามาบลาไว้ดาว่าสุภาษา
If he healed the man on the Sabbath, then they could press charges against Jesus.
เอาไว้เนาะเอาไว้ดกันเนี่ยก็ใส่ชุกรีมีมาบลาไว้ดาปาดกายเล่มมือบุนีนี่เนาะเอาไว้ว่าไพรเชเฮียตากมาที่ไว้ดัลเอาไว้ดามาบลาดัลมือบุนีมา
Then they would have a reason to have him executed.
เลตาเนี่ยเขาไว้ติดพักไว้ดาดอตาเกลอากสิญญาที่ไว้ดากใส่ชุกรีมา
Jesus was aware of what they were thinking.
ใส่ชุกรีติญาไว้ดาตาลาไว้ติดไปสุกมือไว้ดานี่เนาะ
It's not yet his time to die.
แต่สักตัวเพย์สักตัวเนี่ยจะมีไว้ดาสักตัวลาไว้ดากบาที่ไว้ดีนี่ปะ
He could have avoided the situation by not healing the man.
เอาไว้ดามือฮัสเกไว้ดาเนาะตาโอตาลามือตมาบลายไว้ดาปาร์ไกบานี่เซ
Jesus doesn't do that.
ก็ใส่ชุกรีตมาไว้ดีนี่ปะ
Instead, he shows the Pharisees how wicked they were.
แม่เลือดหลอดก็เนี่ยเนาะก็ใส่ชุกรีดินเนี่ยไว้ดาเนาะพอไพรเชติดพานะไว้ติดพาเนาะตัวไว้ดาเทเลนี่เนาะ
They did not care about honoring God by honoring the Sabbath day.
เอาไว้ติดพาเนาะcare ไว้บาเนาะก็มันเนี่ยก็อยู่เซไว้ดาลาก็มาลาปาลาปาปอก็ใส่ยัวเนาะเลือไว้ดาปาโดไว้ดามือบุนีนี่ปะ
They were just looking for an excuse to accuse him.
ไม่ได้ก็เนี่ยเนาะไว้ติดพาเนาะคือไว้ดาเนาะตาเตปุเตเลตาดิตอเลือก็เปเปตอไว้ดาก็ใส่ชุกรีนี่เนาะ
Jesus knew that.
ใส่ชุกรีติญาไว้ดานี่เนาะ
He was going to show them that.
เอาไว้ดาก็ดูเนี่ยไว้ดาไว้ตินี่เนาะ
He turns things around.
เอาไว้ดาขาดตุริกิไว้ดาตา
He calls the man to stand up in front of everyone.
เอาไว้ดาก็เอาไว้ดาปารกานี่เนาะลาก็เสดไว้ดาลึกว่าก็กาเดมเนี่ย
Then, when the man is standing up and facing them,
ว่าเพนี่เนาะเพลปารกานี่เนาะเสดบ้านนี่เนาะหัวเขาดาสัวไว้ติดพาวันนี้
he asks them a question.
เนาะก็ใส่ชุกรีเนาะที่กว่าไว้ติดพาตา
Is it lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?
ก็ใส่ชุกรีที่กว่าเนาะแต่เริ่มมีอบุญนี่เนี่ยเมเปรีมารีตาเมเปรีมาตาเลยเมเปรีอุกิขอเก็บว่าตาตมัวเมเปรีมาที่ดาเลย
It's important to understand that the Jews have a principle called pikuach nefesh.
นะแต่ละเรื่องดอลลาร์นะปกตินะเพื่อดาพยุดาพูดติดพระโอเวดาดอตาตุตาตอโคเตลนะเพคัวนับเช
Means saving a life.
อาคอบเนียวเวดาเลนะตามาปุเพลดาตาตมุมา
So they believed that it was almost always acceptable to break a commandment in order to save a life.
เอาไว้ติดพันนาเวดาเนาะเลเนาะทอบุนี่เนาะดอตาลาอาร์กินี่เนาะตาตุลัวติเลเนาะนักมหากเวดาเนาะตามาโลเนาะเลเอาไว้ตะกันเนี่ยดิตอนเลนักมาปุเพลดาตาตมุกาม
They believed that if you need medical care, you had to wait until the Sabbath was over, unless a life was in danger.
นะเอาไว้ติดพาเนาะเอาไว้หนาไว้ดาเลยเนาะเอาไว้ในมือลูบาไว้ดาเนาะตะกุสยาบลาเนี่ยเนาะอันนั้นบาคอเปตุเลเอาไว้ตะกันเนี่ยมีอบุญวิเวเนาะไม่ได้มีบาเลยเนาะตาตมูเอาไว้ดาเลยตาบายอลเนี่ย
If a life was in danger,
เนี่ยตาตมูไม่เอาไว้ดาเลยตามูไม่เอาไว้ดาเลยตาบายอลเนี่ย
then you could offer medical care on the Sabbath.
Manene kusa yabla nta no ni weda parganita kusa yabla le mo buini si weda.
The Jews could not disagree.
Ayuda po tirpano awe tutulo we bani te siba.
It's always good to do good.
No mi weda no ta la ri weda thobole no ba mata gini no.
It's always acceptable to save a life.
Thobone no tatulo ta tile no awe mma po ple da ta muni.
But then Jesus adds the opposite to his question.
Mane pene ke se shukri no si weda le no ke da le ta ti kwa la thodar ka pa no.
Is it lawful to do harm?
No ko masuma sada ni no bablo ba da do ta tu ta to ni ha.
Is it lawful to kill?
No ko mati da ni bablo ba da do ta tu ta to ni ha.
The answer is obvious.
Ta si se ni no o platra la la.
It's not breaking the Sabbath.
Ta we ni no te me da ta ma ha go da me o bu ni ba.
That is breaking the sixth commandment.
Me ko ni no me we da ta ma ka ma we da ta ma lo hu bo le mati da ge ni no.
At this point, the Pharisees realized that Jesus was not talking about the man who was standing beside Jesus.
No le ko to we ha ni no pa pa she te pa na we te nya la ke we da le we ke se shukri na we da to ko ta ba kha do a pa ga le a so te le ka pa ni ba.
Jesus was talking about them.
Ke se shukri ko to da ba kha da we te pa ge ni no pa pa she ni no.
They had not broken the Sabbath, but the sixth commandment by wanting Jesus dead.
Awe te pani na to maha go we da me o bu ni ba no ba sa te na ki na no awe te pa no maha go we da ta ma lo hu bo no la me da ma ti da ge me la we te pa e do da le ko se shukri te ti we da ni lo.
That's why they were silent.
Le ta ne ko na we te pa o bo ka la we da ni lo.
That's why they didn't respond by saying that Jesus could do good the next day or something like that.
Le ta ne ko we te pa te si ta no de me ba no te le ko se shukri na ma bla ta na ma ta ge te le se me nya te ni a me akate ta la ga te mi me te le ta no bi ma mo.
They were silent
Awe te pa o bo ka la.
because they knew that Jesus knew their sinful thoughts.
Me la we te pa te nya we da le Yeshu te nya we da awe te pa at so ko mo te pa la pwe we da do ta de ba ni lo.
They did not repent.
Pasatana ke awe te pa po ya lo ke ta ba.
Jesus was troubled by their hard hearts.
Ka se shukri ata ud we da do ma la we te pa ta la ko do ma ni lo.
Now, if you know your Old Testament well,
Nume te nya we dan li so si tu aloli tu ko ge ne.
there is a good example of a man who hardened his heart against God.
Ta do te ge we da ka no le pa de ga le we da ama ko tha we da sa mo.
It was King Pharaoh of Egypt.
Me we da so pa paro le ko e ko tu bo.
When Moses came to him to ask that he would let the Israelites leave Egypt, he refused.
Pele samoshi haswa o da ka samoshi me we da ka ple da po isula po le ka ta ku da le ko e ko tu ko ne na a we da the me ku da ne no.
Moses gave him 10 plagues as signs of God's power.
Samoshi na he lo le no ta sa ti the tro a ka ti si na di a me we da ta po no le ka sai wa ta po no ne ka sai wa ta so da mo ni no.
Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not listen to God.
The blo la la no a we so pa paro na ma ko to a ta no to ne ne a we to do ka na we da ka sai wa glu ba.
We see the Pharisees hardening their hearts in the same way that Pharaoh hardened his heart.
Ti we da le pa pa she ti pa ne na we ti pa ma ko to a ta le kle de bo ko di to le so pa paro ma ko to we da ta ni no.
Just as Moses gave Pharaoh signs of God's power, Jesus now gives the Pharisees a sign of his power.
Di no samoshi he we da so pa paro le ka sai wa ata so ta ka ma ta pa no to ne na Yeshu ke ne na a we he we da pa pa she ti pa le an no ka sa da we ata so ta ka ma ta pa no ni no.
He tells the man to stretch out his hand.
Awe da te we da pa ga ne na la ka yu ta we da su.
The man stretches it out and it is no longer paralyzed.
Mane puargane na weda yuta weda su bla na su ne de loble la ba.
Did the Pharisees repent when they saw the power of God at work in Jesus?
Pa parisha po te pane na weda de pa poya la kya ta pela ti weda no kasai wata su ta mo le awe kasai shukri mawe ne ya.
They did not.
Awe te pa mawe ba.
Instead, they did the same thing that Pharaoh did in the days of Moses.
Me me la lor kon ya ma dat mi ko de to no so pa paro mawe da pele awe so mo she muni ne lo.
They made their hearts even harder.
Awe te pa no ma ko ta weda ta do tho de ki ne lo.
They got to work on finding a way to destroy Jesus.
Awe te pa sa tho ma da ta pita ma ku da kle la ka ma ko da ka sai shukri ne lo.
Yes, you heard that right.
Me na na huta ni ba.
The people who were so concerned about keeping the Sabbath got to work on the Sabbath.
No pwa te pa no le awe no cho ko mo pa do da mi obu ni do do le ne na we te pa no ma we da ta no le awe da kan ne mi obu ni we ne.
The people who were concerned about God's law were now plotting to break the commandment, "You shall not kill."
No pe na pwa te pa le no a pa do da mi obu ni te pa no le awe da kan ne le ka sa ywa ta to da to ne na ke ne na pe ne na we te pa no ku tho ma ti we da a le ka ma ti we da ka sai shukri mo le ma ka ma we da ma ha go we da no atamalo ku borbo no le ka sai wa tamalo le ma ti da ri ne no.
What is even more surprising is that Mark mentions that the Pharisees took counsel with the Herodians.
Ta we ne no me ta le a we da kan ne no a ke we da la lo ka ma ka ma se ko pe le pe ne no so ma ku ye tho we da le pa pa she ti pa no we ti pa no ku lo ta no ma ta ko da de Herodia a we a ku re ti pa mo.
This is shocking.
Ta we ne me ta le a pu ti plo go.
The Pharisees did not like foreign rulers like the Roman emperors or the Edomite king Herod.
Pa parisha po ti pa na we ti pa no te ba tu ba ta da pa pa da no le ti ko ga la pe o no de ta le ro me a bo mi so pa ti pa mi ge no no me de me a de a we de kan pa e de ma a we a so pa ki a we so pa hero mi ge ba mo.
There's an old saying in English, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend."
No me le a we de kan ni ta ko to le pa ta pa te we da mo de da le a we de kan ni na you do you da I do da ni no me we da you do you ti the como.
That is what is happening here.
Ta we ni no ma ta pe mo.
People who don't get along are now getting along in order to oppose Jesus.
Pa ti pa la ta ba hu lo ta ba no to po lo ta ba no ke ni na po lo ta no me la we ti pa no to da we da issue.
That would be just like the Karen National Union working together with the Karen Democratic Buddhist Army or with Damada.
Ta we ni no ko lo ga we da di to no a we KNU no ma ta ko da bu ko da a we da kan ni DKBA da me de me no ma ta ko da a we da kan ni ta ma do ti mo so ro ni.
It would take a very exceptional enemy to make these two groups work together.
No ta we ni no ko ba me da ta lo lo so so ka no le du da lo lo so so da pu la ka ma da ta di le pa keep ma ta ko da bu ko.
Throughout the book of Mark, we see that Mark is answering the question, who is Jesus?
Le li ma ku do be ni na pe te we da le so ma ku si se we da ta ti kwa la no Yeshu ne me we dam ta le.
We saw that Jesus has power over diseases and demons.
Pe te we da le Yeshu we da ta so ta ko mo le ta so ta sa te pa do ta na te pa po ko.
Now we see that Jesus is the one who has the authority to interpret how the Sabbath should be observed.
Do ke ne pe te we da le Yeshu na we da me da pa ga le o we da do ta ne so ne ko mo la we da ke te plato we da ta ko mi le no mi obu ni ni na ko ba tam pa do pa ke o dile.
The Jews thought they knew their Sabbath well.
Payu da po tir pa cho mo da la ti nya wa da mu bu ni age ni lo.
They thought that all their rules would earn God's favor.
Awa tir pa na so mo da la tablo tir pa ke le ke sin na ki ole ke sa yu ta ba tu ba ta mo.
But when the Son of Man stands among them, they show that they only knew rules, but not who God is.
Pa sa do pele yu po kwa so te le awe tir kla ni na. Awe tir pa du ne we da la we tir pa ti nya we da te tablo tir pa lo.
So
Ti
do,
nya we da ke sa yu ba.
so do you know who Jesus is?
Nya ne ti nya ke sa Yesu Kri mi we da mtale.
When Jesus says that he holds more authority than the strongest rules, do you believe him?
No, pele Yesu si we da la we da hi ka we da ta ne so ne ko mo do ne we da we ta blela agis hu tir pa mo. Na we da ta we ni a.
Do you believe that Jesus has the right to give rules and the right to explain rules?
No, na we da ke sa Yesu Kri na we da do no ta we da do no ta kweta ya la we da hi lo we da ta ble tir pa. Do we da do ta kweta ya le a shep ya we da ta ble tir pa ni a.
And when Jesus explains the rules, are you willing to listen to him?
No pele ke se shukria we da shep la pia we da tablet tir panino. No thu tha ole no ko dog na onia.
Sometimes when I encourage people to believe in Jesus, they will say,
The block on a pele ye hiri ba we da no pa de no look na we da ke se shukri ni na we tir pa si adi.
I don't like the Christian faith because if I become a Christian, there are so many rules that I have to obey.
Je te chewe da pa kripo ata suta na pa mi la je me kera we da pa kripo ni no. Je ko pa dog na we da table a mama.
When people say this, they show that they do not understand what the Christian faith is all about.
Pele pa misi we da dini na we tir pa dune we da la te tinya we da lu pa kripo ata suta na ni mi we da ta dile ni ba.
They see rules,
Awe te pa tiwe da tablet tir pa.
they do not see Jesus.
Awe te pa te tiwe da Yesu ni ba.
They do not know who Jesus is.
Awe te pa te tinya da awe te pa te tinya ba le Yesu mim tale ni ba.
They do not know that he is King of heaven and earth.
Awe te pa te tinya ba le ke sa Yesu Kri mi we da so pa le mu ko ko ni ba.
They do not know that he is coming back to judge all sinners.
Awe te pa te tinya ba le ke sa Yesu Kri we da ke da ke da ke si nya we da pa ta de ba po te pa kele ni ba.
They do not know that those who believe will live forever with Jesus in heaven.
Awe te tinya we ba le pa te pa la su ki na ke da ni ko ba do ke sa Yesu Kri le mu ko la tu lo yu ni ba.
They do not know how long believers will live with Jesus in glorious rest.
Awe tir pa te tinya da le no kes pasuki na kita tir pa no ko obui ba we da do ke se shukile ta la ta ka popu la ye tho lo so lo thoni ba
Forever.
na ke se shu we pasuki na kita tir pa ni ko obui ba da ke se shukri le ta la ta ka popu lo tu lo yumo.
The rules are a light burden with a glorious purpose.
No tablet tir pa mi we da no ta wi ta yo la pui hu do ta la ta ka po ta to pa ni lo.
I'd like to conclude briefly by talking about two questions that I think you might be wondering about.
No, ye do magte kele na poko da le apu baka do tati kwa kimi na le no ko chok mo wedamo.
The first question is, why do Christians worship on the Sunday instead of the Sabbath day?
Tati kwa sogote pleni na bamni kolo pa kripo tir pa na buta ba to weda ka sai yuana le awe mu Sunday na mu obuni ke da le mu Sunday na le mu te me weda le mu nui ni bale.
The Sabbath is the seventh day of the week.
Ke weda le awe Sabbath ni me weda mu nui atopu ni na me weda mu nui ni te ni.
Which is Saturday.
Me weda mu huni.
And the fourth commandment says that we have to obey the Sabbath day.
No, tamalo lui bobo ne si wa le pasos hiwe da mi obuni na le awe menwini ma.
Jesus obeyed the Sabbath day.
Yeshu na we da dog na we da menwini.
So Why then do Christians observe not the Sabbath day, but the Sunday?
Bam ni ko le na le ta ni ko ne pa ke po te pa na te do na we da na te ma dam a we mu nui ni ba na me me de kan de le we de kan de mu obu ni le pa ko le same day ma.
The reason Christians celebrate on Sunday is because Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday.
Na da ge na le pa ke po te pa na a we da ma la po we da a we bu to ba to ke sa ya le mu obu ni ne le ke sa shu ke so ta ke we da le mu obu ni ho ma.
Earlier, I mentioned that one version of the Ten Commandments says that God made the world in 6 days.
Na le na pa pala so te na le pe ye ta na le ke sa yua na a we da te lo da mu ko ko le hu tho ta bu ma.
And because God rested on the seventh day, so should we.
Le ke sa yua o bu we da le me nui ne te ni ko ni na a te kro le po bu ne me o me nui ne ne ya.
The second one says that the Israelites were delivered from slavery in Egypt.
Ta ki ka ka na le pa Israel po te pa na ba ta ma te ble ta ki le ku le ka ko tu bu.
Now, if there was any event that was as important as these two, what would it be?
No le aweta mata kimi ino le arido weda do mana la me ke weda la rido ter kane kemi weda pele kale mo le po isu la po no ata ku le ku le ko ku tu ka da ka sai shukre ta ga sera tu muta kine.
The early Christian church realized very early that the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead was more important.
Ke weda le ta po la so go le ta me po tir pa so kane na pa kri po tir pa na we tir pa tinya weda le so go le ka tilili na le awe kreta ga sera tu muta ki le ta tini na mi weda talari do ni weda we do ni weda dile pa isula po ata weda le ka kuptu por kinila.
Through Jesus' resurrection, God's people are freed from sin and hell.
Na kapule kasa shukra ta gasa tu muta kinina kasa yo apo ko me tible ta ku weda le ta de ba do le rapu ni la.
That is why the early Christian church moved their worship to Sunday.
Le ta ne ko ni na ta opole asole ta me po so kana awe te pa na awe buto bato no tuge data buto bato le me obuin le sende mo le poko le me kotini mo
Already in the New Testament, we see this.
le li sosia to tropo lead al kotili dane betiwe data inila.
The Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth,
Tame po sa Paulo kwe dana libresu kurithu taupo.
on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come.
Apene na awe siwe da dot ye dito ta tepo lo tu do ge don nui niakla mi koti eni mo pa pota le ta pa po lo pe adoni batabuta po to ko ga derki.
Why the first day?
Bam ni ko le na akoti nui akoti de ni le.
Because that was the day that the church came together for worship.
Na mewe da mini le ta po he pa pota ta le ta buta bata wani la.
When Jesus reveals himself to the Apostle John on the island of Patmos, John says that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and not the Sabbath day in Revelation 1 verse 10.
Le li lo place do te sabor sinina pele ke sai shukri lo plata ta le ta me poso Yohana le awe petmo a kono awe de kan ni no mi we da le no awe no pele awe ta ni ba no le awe kesamuni mo kesamuni no komya ni me da mi kotini no te mi we da le mu ni ni ba mo.
Early Christian sources make it clear that the church worshipped on the Sunday from the earliest times.
Na kewe da le awe na le tau po le sa ta le ta me po so na he pa ta ya kote na a thot na le ashe no le awe ta oponi no sato boto bato we da kasa ywa le mukoti ni no le ta sekto sato akoti le kasa shukri keta we la kini no.
The second question I would like to talk about briefly is, should we still practice a Sabbath rest today?
Ta ti kwa kimi de me le no ye do koto bakani no awe pokro no ma diwe da no pokro obuwe da le me obuwe ani no le menui ni dine ya.
Or has Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath day?
Me kani kasa shukri male rapwe tawe da menui ni ne ya.
Many people will say that Jesus has fulfilled the Sabbath day, and so we don't need to follow it anymore.
Kwa kasi we da le no kasa shukri male rapwe tawe da awe mi obwinili no kone potokro potolo no potwe da awe tamalo we ileba.
I would suggest that we take caution here.
Yake kulu no mo poko patu pata hipulog ta pei.
Yes, there are many laws in the Old Testament that pointed forward to Jesus Christ.
No me we da no ta to we da aka no la adune so we da kasa shukri agimo.
The sacrifices are an example of this.
Ke da luta patir pa no me we da ta do te pei.
Imagine that you are driving to Montreal.
Na cho mo le no nekele no kasu Montreal.
As you're driving down the highway, you will see signs that will tell you how far it is to go to Montreal.
Di ta no lo ka na le ha we ko ni na ba ne ti we da na ta pa no na sai la te pya na le awe de kan ne le Montreal ni na awe de kan ne ke yi we da tele ne.
But once you arrive in Montreal,
Ba sa pele ne me le ti we da le Montreal ne.
you will not see those signs anymore.
Ne ti le we da ta pa no no sai le ba mo.
Why?
Ba me ko le.
You don't need them anymore.
To lo ba le we da ta pa no le ba.
You've already arrived in Montreal.
Ne le ti we da le Montreal le.
In the same way, the laws that point forward to Christ are no longer necessary after Jesus came.
No, look like the book on it now. Awe ta thought it pala dunne we da look say shukri at the hen now. A ke we da la to lo ba we da le ba mo. Pele say shukri he we lakini.
The Sabbath is different.
Me learn no awe me obwini ani loss ho we da.
First of all, it goes back to creation.
Me awe lu ta kele kesi apo ko na da we ni na ke da kiki we da le no atabatemo.
Sabbath rest began even before the fall into sin.
Kewe dalu no awe mi obwini no ata obwini no sato ata dalelu no to kludi le awe de kanini no ta de ba helo teni lo ko kludi ba mo.
It wasn't just for Israel.
De me tele po Israel apote pa go ba.
It was for the whole world.
Me dalu ho ko do prenya go mo.
Second, it's a commandment.
Ta kimi de mi kanina ta we ni mi we da ta malo mo.
The Ten Commandments are the most important part of God's law.
No, kewe dalu ta malo borisini no mi we da ta malo te pala ri do we da le ka sai ba ta to ta tokla.
No one will say that it's okay to kill now because Jesus has fulfilled the law.
But te we da no ga ba mo le no me le ka sai shukri no we da kanene malo ta pwe ta we da ta to ta beli ko ne no we da kane pamati da ne ri lo no but te di ne no ga ba.
No one will say that it's okay to commit adultery because Jesus fulfilled that law.
No, but te we no ga ba no me le awe ebe ma ebe wane ri lo no me le ka sai shukri no malo ta pwe ta we da ta beli ni.
Why then would we say that it's okay to break the Sabbath because Jesus fulfilled it?
Le tani ko ni bam ni le no pe si le no me ta ri lo no le pe me ma ha ga we da no awe da kane ne me obwini no me le ka sai shukri malo ta pwe ta li o ko ni.
Sometimes people will use the argument in the New Testament, all the days are holy and belong to God.
The brother kono pa ke he we da no ta te age lo le no le li so se I thought of true pune no le mini ko mini deni no me da mini so si la ba ka da sai wa.
It sounds pious,
Ta we ni tho we da mu do ma.
but we can only talk about holy days if there are also days that are not holy.
Basana ke na potora tira le awere kane munila asoski tirpana do awere kane do munila to da to soski tirpa
So if we say every day is holy,
misi we da le ni komini de ne soski we ne
then also no day is holy.
le tane ko ne muni ne we ne na to soski le not ni ban.
And that is exactly what I fear will happen if we say that every day is holy.
No ta we ne na me we da ta ta pa te le no I ba yu we da le ko ma ta no pele pe me te we da le mini ko ni de ne mini soski ne.
We will not put enough time aside on any day so that we can devote ourselves to worshiping Jesus Christ.
But pa lo lo so we da mini le lo not ni ba le po ko hilo ala ba ta po bu to we ba to we da ka sai shukri le mini lo so ni ba mo.
I'd like to say again that the Sabbath day was made for man.
Ye do si do tar blo lo no mi o bu ni ne na ba ta ma le pa ga nyo gom.
We need a day of rest.
Pelo ba da mini mi o bu ani de ni.
We need a day to put aside our work
Pelo ba da mini de ni le po ka ba pa ku ye da ta pi ta ma le ta ka pa mo.
and to focus on Jesus Christ.
Do le po kwa tho ta lo su sai shukri o.
That did not change when Jesus came.
Ta we ni no te le lo ku ya ta ba phele sai shukri he lo we ni.
We should not think that it is a burden that we cannot work on the Sabbath day.
Putu krachok mo le no ta we ni me da ta wi ta yo le pa ma ta le me o bu ni te te ba ni. Putu ba chu mo de ni ba.
We should see it as a gift.
Pu kratio la me we da ta hi ni no.
It is an opportunity that we have to look at a glimpse of the heavenly rest that we will experience when Jesus Christ comes back.
Me we da no ta kwe ya ba le no pu ko we da do ta kwa te kwe da bla le ta o bu le mo ko ba mu no le pu ko le kopro ba phele ke sai shukri me ke da ki ke we mo.
May we all be blessed to worship Jesus on every Lord's Day.
Mo kwe tir pa ke le ke sep ko ba so we da le pu bu tho ba tho da ke sai shukri le mu o bu ni na le ke sa mu ni ko mu ni de ko nu de ni ke